I didn't let out a single scream, nor did I break into a panicked run toward the center of the house. I didn't even think to call out anyone's name into the heavy, festive air of the foyer. I simply stepped inside the heavy wooden door, letting it sigh shut behind me with a muted, definitive click, and that was when I saw her lying there on the polished hardwood floor, curled up tightly by the front entrance like a piece of luggage that had been forgotten in the middle of a busy move. Her old winter coat was painfully thin and looked completely threadbare at the elbows from years of constant wear. One of her gray, worn-out slippers had fallen off her foot and lay uselessly on its side near her heels. Inside the main part of the house, sudden bursts of raucous laughter erupted, and the sound of fizzing champagne being poured into flutes chimed like small bells, while the massive stone fireplace breathed out a steady glow of liquid gold. The grandfather clock on the far wall ticked with rhythmic precision toward the stroke of midnight. I took exactly one step forward into the room, and the entire atmosphere seemed to die right in front of me. The winter cold that had followed me in had a physical weight to it that I could feel pressing against my skin. It wasn't just the sharp, stinging bite of the wind that makes you curse and hurry for cover, but rather the heavy, deep-seated kind of cold that settles into your very bones and stubbornly refuses to leave. It had followed me in through the threshold when I opened the door, a low, quiet presence that slipped across the dark hardwood and crept toward the roaring fire as if it had an inherent right to be there. I reached back and closed the door behind me with a gentle touch, making sure the latch clicked into place without a sound. At first, in the heat of the celebration, absolutely no one noticed I was there. She was lying right there on the floor, not resting comfortably on a plush couch, or even on a simple spare chair that could have been pulled close to the radiating warmth of the hearth. She was on the floor right beside the doorway where freezing drafts snake in through the gaps in the old, deteriorating weather stripping. A miserably thin blanket, which felt more like a rough beach towel than an actual winter blanket, was tucked haphazardly under her chin. Her knees were drawn up tight against her chest, as if she were desperately trying to make her small body even smaller and less of an obstacle. One of her hands rested flat on the cold wood, her fingers bent at a strange, cramped angle, and her knuckles ghostly pale from the chill. Her other hand was tucked securely beneath her withered cheek, acting as a meager cushion against the freezing boards of the floor. Her breathing lifted the thin fabric of her coat in shallow, careful waves that I could barely see. I recognized that coat immediately, as I was the one who had bought it for her nearly 6 years ago at a small, cluttered thrift store outside of Portland, Maine. It was the kind of place that always smells like lingering dust and dried lavender. I remember how she had laughed with genuine delight when I first brought it home to her. "You really didn't need to spend your hard-earned money on me," she had said back then, smoothing out the wool sleeve as if it were the finest silk in the world. Now, the inner lining showed through in jagged tears at the cuffs, and the buttons were a mismatched collection of whatever replacements they could find. Her gray, fraying slipper had slid halfway off her heel, revealing a thin sock with a hole at the toe. Inside the house, the party was vibrantly alive. I heard the loud pop of another bottle of bubbly being opened. The sound of laughter swelled again, rolling through the hallways, sounding bright, festive, and entirely careless. The fireplace crackled with the arrogant confidence of something that was being well-fed with expensive oak. Flickering gold light leaped across the wooden mantel and painted the faces of the very people I had grown up with, my family, with a deceptive warmth. I recognized the familiar rhythm of their voices and the specific cadence of their jokes long before I could even make out the individual words. The rich smell of expensive citrus, wood smoke, and spiced sugar floated through the air in a thick cloud. The clock on the wall continued its steady march. 58 seconds. 59. I stood there in the shadows with my heavy work coat still on, my boots wet with the melting slush of upstate New York snow, and I felt the creeping cold of the foyer find my calves. For a fleeting moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe she had just fallen and couldn't get back up. Maybe she had stubbornly insisted on sitting there because she was proud and didn't want to ask for help. I hoped against hope that this was just a tragic accident that would be rectified the very instant someone in the other room noticed she wasn't in her chair. I leaned down slowly and touched her frail shoulder with a trembling hand. "Hey," I whispered into the dark. Her eyes opened slowly, taking their time like heavy windows being lifted on old, rusted metal tracks. When she finally saw me, her mouth curved into that specific, gentle smile that used to represent the very idea of home to me. "Oh," she said softly, her voice a mere rasp. "You're early." "I'm not early, Grandma," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I slid my thick leather gloves off and pressed my bare fingers to her thin wrist. Her pulse was there, thankfully steady, though it was much too slow for my liking. Her skin felt like a piece of fine porcelain that had been left out on a frozen window sill all night. "What on earth are you doing down here on the floor?" She fluttered her free hand in a dismissive gesture. "It's perfectly fine, dear. I just didn't want to be in anyone's way tonight." In the way, the words landed in my mind like a small, heavy stone dropped into a deep pool of still water. The ripples spread outward from that point, quiet and relentless, changing everything they touched. Inside the living room, the frantic countdown finally reached 10. 9. Someone let out a loud, joyful whoop. 8. The volume on the television rose to a crescendo. 7. A chorus of voices joined in together, sounding sloppy, drunken, and joyful. 6. I looked past her and into the brightly lit living room. Hand-knit stockings hung from the mantel in a perfect row, looking plush and bright, each one meticulously stitched with a name in thick red thread. I saw my mother's name, my father's, my brother, and my sister. There was a glaring, empty space between two of the brass hooks where another stocking clearly should have been. The absence of that one stocking screamed louder at me than all the laughter in the room combined. 5. I slid my own heavy-duty coat off and draped it gently over her fragile shoulders. The thick fabric was heavy and still held the residual heat from my own body. She let out a long sigh as if she had been holding her breath for a very long time. "You'll get cold, honey," she murmured. "I'm fine," I said, and my voice came out sounding even and clipped in the way it always does when I am actually not fine at all. 4. I stood up to my full height. The room beyond the dark doorway was a perfect picture of a classic American celebration, people standing close together with glasses raised, and cheeks flushed red from the heat and the alcohol. My mother's hair was styled perfectly, every strand sprayed into a rigid, permanent place. My father held court near the fire with a glass of scotch in his hand, smiling as if the past year had done him nothing but personal favors. My brother, Mark, was leaning against the back of the sofa, halfway through telling a joke that I was sure was crude. My sister laughed right on cue. 3. I took one heavy step forward into the light. The cold of the entryway followed me like a physical shadow. 2. Someone finally noticed me standing there. His loud laugh caught abruptly in her throat, ending in a strange gagging sound. Mark's eyes flicked toward the doorway, widening for a second before he looked back down at the amber liquid in his glass. My mother turned around, a polite, practiced host smile already forming on her lips. 1. "Happy New," my father began to roar, his voice full of bravado. Midnight officially struck. Fireworks began to crackle and boom somewhere in the distance over the snowy hills. The television erupted in a cacophony of cheers and music. Glasses clinked together in a frantic celebration. And then, as if someone had cut a wire, a sudden, suffocating silence landed over the room. I stood squarely in the threshold, my heavy boots planted firmly on the invisible line between the warmth of the party and the freezing cold of the hallway. My coat was still lying across her shoulders on the floor behind me. My hands were empty and balled into fists. My voice, when I finally spoke, did not rise in volume at all. "She was sleeping on the floor," I said. I didn't frame it as a question or an accusation. I stated it as a cold, hard fact. The kind of fact that is so ugly, it doesn't need any decoration to make its point. My mother's festive smile froze instantly, looking as brittle as thin ice on a window pane. "What are you doing here?" she asked. her voice trembling slightly as if the mere question could somehow rearrange the reality of the room. "I came home," I said simply. I looked at each of them in turn, letting my gaze linger on their expensive clothes and then on the empty hook on the mantel. I didn't think I needed to call first. My father set his heavy glass down on the side table with a slow, deliberate care that suggested he was trying to maintain his dignity. "This isn't the time for one of your moods," he said. "We are in the middle of a celebration." Behind me, in the dark, she shifted her weight and let out a soft, thin cough that sounded heartbreakingly polite. I felt the sound in my chest like a physical bruise being pressed by a thumb. "I know exactly what time it is, Dad," I said. "That is precisely why I am standing here." Mark let out a short, sharp laugh that held no. "Come on, Lena, don't come in here and start making a scene on New Year's." I didn't raise my voice to meet his. Instead, I stepped fully into the warmth of the living room, and I felt the cold from the hallway come with me, curling around their ankles and the legs of the expensive chairs, reaching out for the heat of the fire like a predator. I turned back around and bent down, sliding my arms beneath her frail body with a practiced, steady care I had learned through years of work. She weighed so much less than she used to, she felt like she was made of nothing but air and old memories. She made a small, soft sound when I lifted her. It wasn't a sound of pain, but one of pure, exhausted relief. "Hey now," she whispered into my ear. "You really don't have to do all this." "I do, Grandma," I said. I straightened my back, holding her close against my chest. Her wrinkled cheek rested against my shoulder just like it had when I was a small child, back when summer storms would rattle the window panes, and she would tell me the thunder was just the sky talking to the trees. The entire room had gone deathly still. No one lifted their glass to their lips. No one dared to speak. I met my father's hard eyes across the room. "We are going to talk," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner. "But I'm not doing it while she's down there." I turned my back on them and carried her past the flickering firelight, past the half-empty champagne bottles, and toward the deep, honest quiet that was waiting for us beyond the front door. 2 hours earlier, the state highway had been almost entirely empty in that specific way that only a deep winter night can manage. It was quiet enough that I could almost hear the echoes of my own thoughts bouncing off the interior of the car. Snow drifted across the black asphalt in thin, uncertain lines, not enough to truly slow my progress, but just enough to remind me of exactly where I was. The dashboard clock glowed a tired, pale blue. 9:57 p.m., the radio was murmuring through a list of the year's top hits, hosted by cheerful voices that sounded way too awake for the darkness of the woods. I hadn't told a single soul in the family that I was coming home. It wasn't intended to be a secret that would sting them. It was simply a matter of habit. In my line of work as a first responder, you quickly learn how to move from place to place without the need to announce yourself to the world. You learn the hard way that plans change in a heartbeat, and that promises are usually best kept small and flexible. And if I were being truly honest with myself as I drove through the snow, I wanted to see the look on her face when I walked through the door. I wanted to see that soft surprise, the way her eyes would widen with joy, and then crease at the corners like time itself was smiling at me. The "Welcome to Saratoga Springs" sign flashed briefly past my headlights, the paint chipped, and the reflective letters dulled by years of road salt and mountain sun. Home. The word felt strange and heavy on my tongue. I hadn't actually lived within these city limits in a very long time. Not really. I passed the old diner where she used to take me for grilled cheese after school, the small bell over the door jangling in my memory like a happy laugh. I drove past the local pharmacy with the perpetually cracked front window. Maple Street was the next turn. The houses there were all stitched together with long strings of colorful lights that made the entire night feel like it had been sewn into place. The dispatch center had been unnervingly quiet earlier that evening. One of the guys at the front desk had even joked with me, "Go home, Lena. It's New Year's Eve and nothing is happening. I had just nodded and signed out, the routine muscle memory of the job easing me into the long drive up north. I kept telling myself that I was just stopping by for a quick visit. I'd stay for the midnight kiss, give her a long hug, and maybe share a cup of hot cocoa if she was still awake. I kept telling myself it would be an easy, pleasant night. I parked my car half a block away from the house, another old habit from work. The engine made a ticking sound as it began to cool down, the metal popping softly in the frozen air. When I finally stepped out of the vehicle, the cold wrapped around me in a way that felt oddly personal. My breath left my mouth in thick, pale clouds that drifted for a moment before vanishing into the night. The fresh snow under my boots made that familiar, high-pitched squeak, a sound that always instantly transports me back to the winters of my childhood, when the world felt so much smaller and a lot safer than it does now. As I walked toward the house, I found myself remembering the very last time she had come to visit me at my apartment. She had insisted on bringing a large tin of homemade sugar cookies wrapped in layers of aluminum foil, the edges all bent and mangled from the bus trip. "I brought these so you don't forget how things are actually supposed to taste," she had said with a wink. She had laughed then, the sound of it thin but still incredibly bright. I had promised her that night that I would come home more often to see her. We always made that same promise to each other. The house looked exactly the same as I approached it. There was a fresh coat of white paint on the porch railing and a massive, expensive-looking wreath hanging on the front door. It was clear that money had been spent here recently. Care had been taken with the exterior. Through the large front window, I could see shadows dancing against the warm yellow walls. The heat of the house seemed to spill out into the night in a soft, inviting glow. The kind of light that suggests deep comfort without ever asking who that comfort is actually intended for. I paused at the bottom of the porch steps. For a single heartbeat, I seriously considered knocking on the door, calling out a greeting, and doing things the polite, expected way. That old, familiar voice in the back of my head, the one that had learned at a young age how to smooth over rough edges and keep everyone happy, cleared its throat. But then I noticed the draft. It was a physical thing, slipping out from under the heavy door and brushing against my ankles even though I was still standing outside. I frowned at the door and reached out for the brass handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open gently. Inside the foyer, the air changed immediately. The biting cold from the street followed me in, clinging to the wool of my coat and the strands of my hair. I closed the door behind me quickly to keep the chill from spreading further into the house. That was the exact moment I saw her lying there. But before I processed the floor, before I saw the towel-thin blanket and the missing slipper, I had been thinking about 100 other things. I had been thinking about the way she used to wait up for me when I was a rebellious teenager, always keeping the light on in the kitchen and pretending she wasn't worried sick. I thought of how she would sit at the small wooden table with a mug of tea she never quite finished, just listening for the sound of my footsteps on the porch. I thought of the specific way she would say my name, like it was a quiet reassurance she was giving to herself. I had been thinking about the $800 I sent home every single month from my paycheck. I sent it for groceries, for the heating bill, for her heart medication. The small peace of mind it bought me every time I hit the send button on the bank app. I had told myself for months that the money was enough. I had told myself that my parents and siblings had everything under control. I had told myself over and over that she was doing just fine. When I finally opened that door and felt the warmth of the party rush past me, I had fully expected to hear her voice being the first thing to greet me. I expected a cheerful call from the living room, the familiar shuffle of her feet, or something to indicate she was part of the fun. Instead, there was nothing but the cold floor. She was lying there, curled up near the threshold as if she had chosen that spot deliberately, because it was close enough to the door to make her feel less isolated from the world outside. The blanket they had given her barely even covered her thin shoulders. Her silver hair was flattened on one side against the wood, the strands catching the flickering light from the hallway. I saw the coat I had bought her, the lone slipper, and the way her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. The noise coming from the living room didn't even pause for a second. Someone laughed incredibly hard at a joke that I was certain had been told a dozen times already that night. A champagne cork popped with a festive bang. The voice of the TV announcer rose and fell with a kind of rehearsed excitement, counting down a monumental moment that hadn't even arrived yet. I crouched down low beside her. "Hey," I whispered into the dark, being careful not to startle her out of her sleep. Her eyes opened with a slow, heavy effort, as if she were waking up from a place that took a great deal of energy to leave behind. When she finally saw my face, the initial confusion on her features smoothed out into instant recognition and then a flash of pure joy. "There you are," she said. "I must have dozed off for a minute." "Why are you down here on the floor, Grandma?" I asked her, keeping my voice as low and calm as possible. She glanced briefly toward the bright lights of the living room and then looked back at me. "They're very busy in there, Lena," she said, as if that simple statement explained the entire situation. "It's a party, a very busy party." The words seemed to fit together too easily in her mouth, like they were part of a script she had been practicing for a long time. I slipped one of my gloves off and pressed my fingers against the skin of her wrist, counting her pulse without even realizing I was doing it. Her skin was freezing. It wasn't at a life-threatening level yet, but she was much colder than anyone should ever be in a house with a roaring fire and a high-end heating system. I pulled my own heavy coat off and settled it carefully around her shoulders. She made that small, heartbreaking sound again, that soft noise that I knew would be stuck in my head for weeks to come. "You really didn't have to do that, honey," she murmured. "I did," I said, and the words came out sounding much steadier than I felt on the inside. From the other room, my mother's voice rose up, sounding bright, musical, and perfectly content. "5 minutes to go," she called out, and a wave of communal laughter followed her announcement. I looked back down at the hard floor, the freezing draft, and the thin towel of a blanket. I thought about the empty space on the fireplace mantel where her stocking was missing, though I hadn't even stood up to see it clearly yet. I thought about every bank transfer I had made, and the absolute trust I had placed in my family to take care of her. I thought about how often she had called me and told me not to worry about a thing. I stood up, the decision finally settling into my mind like a heavy weight that I recognized from 100 different scenes on the job. "I'll be right back," I told her softly. She reached out with her frail hand and caught the edge of my sleeve, her fingers feeling light but insistent. "Please don't make a fuss," she said. "It's the start of the new year." I gave her a small smile, the kind of smile that never even comes close to reaching the eyes. "I know, Grandma," I said. "That's exactly why." I turned my body toward the living room, feeling the artificial warmth of the party wash over me and the rising noise of the celebration meeting me at the door. I took one step forward, and I could feel the patient, cold air of the foyer following right behind me. But I went back to her first, before I ever stepped into that living room, and before I listened to the long list of explanations that I knew were already lining up in their heads, like guilty excuses waiting for their turn to be told. I knelt down beside her again, because the floor was just too cold, and because I needed to look at her clearly without the flickering firelight softening the harsh edges of the truth. "How long have you been lying down here?" I asked. She hesitated for a second, and I knew it wasn't because she didn't know the answer, but because she did. Her eyes slid away from mine and toward the white baseboard, tracing the line where the dust had gathered. "Oh," she said with a forced lightness. "I suppose I just lost track of the time." That was all the answer I needed. I tucked my heavy coat even closer around her thin shoulders, smoothing down the collar in the exact same way she used to smooth my hair when I was a little girl. Her hands were shaking whenever she thought I wasn't looking at them. It was a fine, constant tremor, like the way leaves are stirred by a breeze that you can't quite feel on your own skin. "Did you have anything to eat tonight?" I asked. She gave me a small, careful smile. "They told me they were saving the dessert for later." Saving it for later. Saving it for someone else. From my position on the floor, I could see directly into the living room now. I didn't have a full view, but it was enough. It was enough to notice the plates of food stacked high on the coffee table with crumbs still clinging to the edges. It was enough to count the tall champagne flutes, each one marked with a smear of expensive lipstick or a thumbprint near the gold rim. It was enough to see that the fire was burning strong, and that the chairs had been pulled close together in a tight circle, with their bodies angled inward to protect the warmth, as if it were a private, exclusive thing. I stood up slowly, my own knees protesting the cold that had already settled into them. I took in the sight of the doorway, and the draft that slipped through the gap in the wood like it had learned the path by heart. I tried to imagine her trying to sleep while that cold air crawled up her spine. I imagined her waking up in the dark and deciding not to bother anyone because she didn't want to be a burden. I imagined her telling herself over and over that she didn't really need much to be happy. I turned back to her one more time. "Why didn't you wake one of them up to help you?" I asked. Her mouth tightened for a brief moment, then it relaxed back into that familiar, soft gentleness. "They all looked so happy," she said. "I didn't want to be the one to spoil their night." Those words hit me much harder than anything else had that evening. It wasn't even anger yet. It was something much heavier and more suffocating than that. It was something that pressed down on my lungs until my breath started to come in short, jagged bursts. "I am going to go get you a proper chair," I said. "Oh no," she replied quickly, her eyes widening. "I am perfectly fine right here, really." I just nodded because I knew that arguing with her would only waste more time, and time felt like the one thing we were already running out of. I stepped into the living room. The heat of the house wrapped around me immediately, feeling thick and cloying with the smell of cinnamon, wood smoke, and expensive alcohol. My mother was busy arranging silk napkins on a silver tray, her movements looking brisk and well-practiced. My father was still standing near the mantel with his glass in hand, watching the television as if it were providing him with the secrets of the universe. Mark was leaning against the wall, mindlessly scrolling through his phone, and was sitting cross-legged on the expensive rug, laughing at something a person off-camera had just said. Absolutely no one moved to make a space for me in the circle. No one even bothered to ask where I had come from or how I had gotten into the house. My eyes went straight to the fireplace mantel. The stockings were hanging there in a perfect, neat row, looking plush and expensive with their cuffs turned just so. I read the names on them without even meaning to: Dad, Mom, Mark. That was the entire list. Between stocking and the very edge of the wooden mantel was a single, empty brass hook. It was just bare wood with a faint, dusty outline where something else had once hung. The absence of her name roared in my ears. "Where is hers?" I asked, my voice cutting through the noise. My mother turned around, her practiced smile already forming on her face, but it faltered and died the second she followed my gaze to the empty hook. "Oh," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "She really doesn't need all that fuss, you know how she is." "All that fuss," I repeated. "A simple piece of fabric with her name on it." "She's fine," Mark said, snorting as he looked up from his phone. "She actually likes it down there by the door. She told us it's much quieter for her." I looked at my brother, really looked at him for the first time in a year. His cheeks were flushed bright red from the heat, and his eyes were glassy from the drink. He shrugged his shoulders as if this were just a matter of personal preference, like someone choosing a seat near the aisle in a movie theater. My father cleared his throat, his expression darkening. "You are overreacting as usual," he said. "She is perfectly fine. We check on her regularly." "When was the last time you checked?" I asked, and he just frowned at me. "Don't you dare start this tonight of all nights." "Answer the question, Dad," I said, and my voice stayed perfectly level. I could hear it sounding that way, the specific, clinical tone I used at work when I was simply asking for the facts of a situation. My mother stepped toward me, placing a manicured hand on my arm. "We gave her a blanket," she said in a soothing voice. "She told us she wanted to get some fresh air." I glanced back toward the front door. "It is 30 degrees outside right now," I said. "That isn't fresh air, that is freezing cold." "She isn't a child," my father snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. "She is perfectly capable of speaking up if she needs something." "She did speak up," I said. "She spoke up by deciding not to bother any of you because she knew you wouldn't listen." The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thin and tight like a wire about to snap. I moved over to the expensive leather couch and pulled a heavy wooden chair closer to the fireplace. The legs of the chair scraped loudly across the floor, the sound sharp enough to cut right through the chatter on the television. Finally stood up from the rug, her expression guarded. "What do you think you're doing, Lena?" she asked. "I'm fixing this," I said. I went back to the dark doorway and crouched down again, sliding my arms beneath her frail body. She protested softly, in that way she always did, apologizing for the terrible trouble of being cared for by her own granddaughter. I lifted her up, feeling the shocking lightness of her frame. I felt the way her weight settled into my arms like a gesture of absolute trust. As I carried her into the light, I began to take a mental inventory of her condition without even trying to. Her skin was cool to the touch, her breathing was steady but shallow, she was alert and oriented to her surroundings, and there were no visible signs of trauma, though the signs of long-term neglect were everywhere. The medical terms lined up in my head, sounding clinical and precise. The room had gone completely quiet again. My mother hovered nearby, nervously wringing her hands. My father went back to staring at the fire as if it might provide an answer for him. Mark refused to meet my eyes, and his face began to crumple as she looked at Grandma. I set her down gently in the chair I had moved, positioning it close enough to the warmth that the flickering light of the fire kissed her knees. I tucked my own coat more securely around her shoulders, and then I went to fetch a much thicker wool blanket from the hallway linen closet. It still smelled of cedar and old mothballs. She let out a long, contented sigh as I draped the heavy fabric over her. "There," I said softly. She looked up at me, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You really didn't have to go through all that trouble," she said. "I know," I replied, "but I did anyway." Behind me, my father finally spoke up, his voice edged with a sharp irritation. "You are making all of us look very bad right now." I turned around slowly to face him. "No, Dad," I said. "I am simply showing you what all of you already look like." The grandfather clock on the wall continued to tick. Midnight had officially passed now. Outside, the fireworks continued to crackle and then fade away, sounding distant and hollow. I looked at each of them, one by one, making sure they felt the weight of my gaze. "She was sleeping on the floor," I said again, letting the words sit in the air between us. "That ends tonight." No one tried to argue with me this time. No one laughed. The celebration in the house had officially curdled, and they all knew it. The fire popped loudly, sending a single bright spark flying up the chimney. The cold from the foyer still lingered at the edges of the room, patient and waiting for its moment. And for the very first time since I had walked through that door, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't just about one single night. It never had been. The silence that follows a direct confrontation has a very specific sound of its own. It hums low and vibrates with tension, much like a power line pulled far too tight in a winter storm. I could feel that tension in the hinge of my jaw, in the rigid set of my tired shoulders, and in the way my hands desperately wanted to clench into fists, though I forced them to remain still. She sat there by the fire, the heavy wool blanket rising and falling in time with her steady breath. A faint bit of color had finally begun to creep back into her thin, pale cheeks. That was the only thing that mattered to me in that moment. It was the only thing in the entire room that carried any real weight. I turned back to the rest of them, my gaze sweeping over their festive outfits and their startled expressions. "We are going to have a conversation about the money," I said, my voice cutting through the remaining festive atmosphere. My mother's head snapped up immediately at the mention of finances. "What money are you talking about?" she asked, her voice high and defensive. "The $800 I send home every single month," I replied. "The money that is clearly labeled and earmarked specifically for her care." My father scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "We don't need a lecture from you about our household finances. We have everything under control." "I'm not giving you a lecture, Dad," I said. "I'm asking you a very simple question. Where did that money actually go?" Mark let out another laugh, but this one was far too loud and much too fast to be genuine. "What, do you actually think we're stealing from our own grandmother?" I met his glassy eyes and held them. "I think the heating system in this house clearly works," I said, gesturing to the vents. "I can see the fire is burning strong. I can see that every seat on the leather couch is full, and yet she was lying on the floor in a freezing draft." Took a small, instinctive step back, her hip bumping into the mahogany side table. An empty champagne glass rattled against the wood. "We use the money for the house, Lena," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "It's for the benefit of everyone who lives here." "For everyone," I repeated, my voice dripping with a cold irony. I looked around the room, really taking in the details I had missed in my initial shock. I saw the fresh coat of designer paint on the walls and the plush, brand-new area rug beneath their feet. I looked at the massive high-definition television mounted flush against the stone of the chimney. I noticed the expensive surround sound system tucked neatly into the corners of the room. "When exactly did you remodel the kitchen?" I asked. My mother hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "Last spring," she whispered. "And that vacation you all took?" I asked. "The one you posted 100 pictures from, the trip to the beach house on the Outer Banks." "That was," she began, her voice failing her. "Paid for," I finished for her. "It was paid for around the exact same time that her heart medication prescriptions lapsed at the pharmacy." The words fell into the room, heavy, exact, and impossible to ignore. I hadn't explicitly planned to say them in that way, but the truth just came out of me like a tidal wave. My father's face darkened with a sudden, fierce anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. You have no right to make those kinds of claims." "I do know, Dad," I said, my voice remaining calm. "I called the pharmacy in Saratoga on the drive over here just to check if she needed a refill. I found out they haven't seen any of you in 2 months." Silence snapped back into place, even more suffocating than before. His eyes filled with tears. "We meant to fix the prescription issue, Lena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We really did." "When?" I asked her. She just looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I shifted my weight, grounding myself on the rug. "Here is what I know to be true," I said, speaking slowly and clearly so there was no room for misunderstanding. "She needs a house with consistent, reliable heat. She needs proper bedding and a place to sit that doesn't require her to ask for permission. She needs her medication taken on a strict schedule, and more than anything, she needs her dignity." My mother's voice trembled as she looked at me. "We didn't think it was that bad, we really didn't." "I know," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You didn't think I would actually show up and see it for myself." That sentence changed the entire energy of the room. It was like a heavy door had been slammed shut somewhere deep inside the house. Mark's mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again. My father's broad shoulders sagged just a fraction of an inch, pressed her shaking hands to her face to hide her crying. "We thought you were too busy with work," my mother said, her tears finally spilling over. "We thought. You thought the distance would keep the uncomfortable questions away," I said. She shook her head, her sobbing becoming more pronounced. We truly thought she was doing fine. I looked back at the chair by the fire, at the way she held herself so small and composed, even now. She was surviving, I said. That is not the same thing as doing fine. My father stepped forward again, his voice becoming sharp and defensive. Enough of this. You do not get to come into my home and judge us like this. I didn't move an inch. I'm not judging you, Dad, I said. I am documenting a situation. The word documenting hung in the air, clinical, cold, and professional. Mark laughed again, but there was a distinct note of panic beneath the sound. What exactly does that mean, Lena? What are you saying? It means, I said, that this isn't just a private family disagreement anymore. My mother's eyes widened with a sudden realization. Don't do that, she pleaded. Please don't. I kept my voice perfectly even. Neglect, I said. The neglect of a dependent adult. That is what I am looking at right now. Let out a sob. We didn't hurt her. No one ever laid a finger on her. You left her on the floor, I said. In the middle of a New York winter, you can't argue with that. That isn't abuse, my father snapped, his face turning a deep shade of purple. I nodded once, my expression stony. It is, Dad. By the legal definition, that is exactly what it is. I let them sit with that thought for a moment. I let the crackling fire do the talking. I let the grandfather clock tick away the seconds. She stirred slightly in the armchair. As she said softly, using the name she had always used for me since the day I was born, "Please, dear, don't be so hard on them." I walked over and crouched in front of her again. I'm not being hard, Grandma, I said gently, taking her hands in mine. I'm being careful, there's a difference. She reached out with one hand and patted my cheek, the gesture feeling light and deeply apologetic. They're trying their best, she murmured. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them again to face the truth. Trying starts right now, I said. I stood up and turned back to face my family. This entire situation stops tonight, I said. Not tomorrow morning, not after a round of apologies, right now. My father swallowed hard, his bravado finally starting to slip. What are you actually saying? I chose my words with the same precision I used when I was filing a formal report on a call. I am saying that she is never sleeping on the floor again, I said. Not ever. And the rest of it? Mark asked, his voice tight with worry. The rest of it, I said, is going to be brought into the light. My mother's hands were shaking visibly now. You wouldn't actually do that to your own parents, she said. I met her gaze and didn't blink. I already am, I replied. The truth, once it was finally spoken out loud, didn't require any extra volume. It didn't need threats or theatrics. It just sat there in the center of the living room, solid, immovable, and devastating. Behind me, the fire continued to crackle. In front of me, their faces shifted as the easy certainty of their lives began to drain away. She slept on the floor, I thought to myself. That ends tonight. The fire had burned down to a much steadier, calmer flame by the time the shouting and the frantic defending finally stopped. What remained in the house was something much quieter and significantly heavier. It was like the moment immediately after a heavy door slams shut, when you finally realize it isn't going to open again on its own. She sat in the chair I had moved for her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching all of us with that same gentle, focused attention she had given me for my entire life. She looked as if this were just another small family disagreement that she could eventually smooth over with a little bit of patience. She looked as if she truly believed that love alone could fix what a year of neglect had broken. She said softly, "That's enough, honey." I turned toward her and the word caught me completely by surprise. Enough. It sounded like an act of mercy. It sounded like a desperate plea for peace. My father rubbed his face with both of his hands, looking exhausted. The anger had mostly drained out of him by now, leaving behind something much smaller and far more afraid than the man I had known growing up. "We will fix it," he said, his voice cracking. "We will do better, I promise, just, please don't take this any further than it has already gone." My mother nodded along with him, tears streaking her expensive makeup and ruining her perfect holiday look. "Please," she said, "we just made a terrible mistake." A mistake, singular, accidental. I took a deep breath and felt the two distinct parts of my soul pulling in opposite directions. One part of me was the first responder, counting the facts, the temperatures, and the patterns of behavior I saw before me. The other part was the granddaughter who remembered the bedtime stories and the way she used to hum old jazz tunes while she folded the laundry. I had learned a long time ago that those two parts of a person rarely agree on anything. "This isn't about punishment," I said, keeping my voice low so as not to startle Grandma. "This is about her physical safety." Mark scoffed weakly from the corner of the room. "She's perfectly safe now, isn't she?" "She is safe because I am standing here," I said. "What happens when I have to go back to work? What happens when I'm not here to check the thermostat?" Silence was the only answer I received. Wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "What exactly do you want us to do, Lena?" she asked. I glanced at the chair, at the thick blanket, and at the small, resilient woman who had taught me exactly how to be steady when the rest of the world was being too loud. "I want her to be treated like she actually matters," I said. "Every single day, not just when you think someone might be watching you." My mother reached out for Grandma's hand again. "She does matter to us," she said. Grandma smiled at my mother then, the same forgiving, beautiful curve of the mouth she had always possessed. "I know I do," she said, and that was the real problem. She always knew. She always chose to assume the best of people, even when they were giving her their absolute worst. She had spent her entire life absorbing their neglect so they wouldn't have to feel guilty about it. I crouched down beside the chair one last time. "Look at me, Grandma," I said gently. She did. Her eyes were clear and bright with the tears she was stubbornly refusing to let fall in front of the family. "I don't want any trouble," she said. "I don't want to see anyone get hurt over this." I nodded my head. "Neither do I." "Then just let it go," she whispered. "We are all together now, that is enough for me." I felt those words press against my ribs like a physical weight. Together, enough. I desperately wanted those words to be true. I stood up and turned back to face my family. "Here is what is going to happen," I said. "Tonight, she is coming home with me." My mother inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her chest. "You're taking her away from us." "I am taking her somewhere warm," I said. "I am taking her somewhere where she has an actual bed and a room of her own." My father opened his mouth as if to lodge a formal protest, then he thought better of it and closed it. He looked down at the hardwood floor. "And what happens after that?" "After that," I said, "we are going to make sure this never happens again." Mark shook his head slowly. "You're still going to report us, aren't you?" I didn't answer him right away. I looked at Grandma. She was watching me, waiting for my response, her face looking open and trusting. The immense weight of that trust pressed down on me with a crushing force. "I am not erasing what happened here tonight," I said finally. "I am not going to pretend that I didn't find her on the floor." My mother began to sob again. "You will ruin our reputation. You'll ruin us." I met her eyes. "You did that to yourselves the moment you uninvited me and left her in the foyer." She flinched as if I had struck her. I turned back to the armchair and held out my hands. "Let me help you up, Grandma," I said. She hesitated for a second, then she reached out and took my hands. Her grip was light, but surprisingly sure. When she finally stood up, she leaned into my side just enough to steady herself. I felt then just how thin she really was, how easily she could have been missed if I hadn't been looking for her. As we began to move slowly toward the front door, stepped forward. "We really do love you, Grandma," she said. Grandma paused at the threshold and looked back at her expression looking kind, tired, and deeply wise. "I know you do, sweetheart," she said, "but love needs to look like something real." The words settled over the festive room like a layer of cold dust. At the door, she squeezed my hand with a surprising amount of strength. "Promise me something," she whispered. "What's that?" I asked. "Don't let this situation harden your heart," she said. "Justice is important, but mercy matters just as much." I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. "I am trying to carry both of them, Grandma." She nodded her head. "Just make sure you don't drop yourself in the process." Outside, the freezing night air was waiting for us, sharp and honest. I wrapped my heavy coat even around her fragile shoulders and guided her carefully down the porch steps. Fireworks were still bursting somewhere further down the street, their bright colors bleeding into the dark sky. We could hear cheers rising and falling from the other houses we passed, people who were entirely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. At the curb, I opened the passenger door of my car and eased her into the seat. I started the engine, and the heater roared to life, filling the small space with warm air. She let out a long, quiet sigh that finally loosened the knot in my chest. I looked back at the front door of the house. My family was standing there in the light of the foyer, looking like small, uncertain shapes. I met my father's gaze one last time. "This ends tonight," I said to the empty air. As I closed her door and walked around to the driver's side, I felt the winter night press in around us. It was cold, yes, but it felt clean. I slid into the seat and put the car in gear. The clock on the dashboard read 12:27. A brand new year had officially begun. The heater hummed with a steady rhythm as we pulled away from the curb and left Maple Street behind. It was a reassuring sound that felt much louder than the fading fireworks in the distance. She sat in the passenger seat with both of her hands wrapped tightly around the air vents, letting the warmth reach her frozen fingers first, then her palms. The dashboard clock glowed with a soft white light. 12:31 a.m., and for the first time all night, time felt like it was moving forward instead of closing in on me. "You didn't have to leave the party like that," she said gently, her eyes fixed on the windshield where the snowflakes were melting on contact. "They are still your family, after all." I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, my knuckles finally loosening their grip as the heat did its work. "Family doesn't put the people they love on the floor, Grandma," I said. I didn't say it with anger. I said it because it was the truth. She turned her head to look at me, studying my profile in the dark as she decided whether to push the issue or let the thought pass. "They didn't mean any real harm," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "They just meant to prioritize their own comfort over yours." The road ahead of us was almost entirely empty. The streetlights painted the fresh snow in shades of pale gold. We passed rows of quiet houses with their curtains drawn and their televisions glowing blue in the dark living rooms. Somewhere, I heard laughter spill out onto a front porch. Somewhere else, a heavy door clicked shut against the cold. The world just kept going, indifferent and relentless. When we finally reached my apartment building, I parked as close to the entrance as possible so she wouldn't have far to walk. I helped her inside and guided her toward the bedroom. I had fresh, clean sheets on the bed, looking crisp and white. A small lamp cast a warm, inviting circle of light over the mattress. She sat down carefully, then she let herself sink back into the pillows, giving in to the softness in a way the hardwood floor never could. "Oh," she breathed out, a look of pure contentment on her face. "This is very nice." I smiled at her and pulled the heavy comforter up to her chin. "You deserve nice things, Grandma," I said. She reached out and caught my wrist before I could turn away. She said, "Promise me you won't let this whole thing turn you bitter toward them." I sat down on the edge of the mattress. I won't, I said, even though I knew it was a promise I would have to work hard to keep. I'll just let it make me more careful. She nodded, looking satisfied. Careful is a good thing to be. When she finally fell asleep, it happened almost instantly, like a light being switched off. Her breathing became deep, steady, and even. I stood there and watched her for a long time, committing the sight to my memory, the way her face finally softened when she wasn't trying to be agreeable for everyone else. I watched the blanket rise and fall, knowing she was safe and warm. In the living room, I sat in the dark with a mug of water that had gone cold in my hands. I let the events of the night finally catch up to me. My phone buzzed on the table, missed calls, text messages, and apologies that were tangled up with pure panic. I didn't answer any of them. Not yet. What was coming next was going to take a lot of time and a lot of difficult conversations that wouldn't fit into a single night. There would be appointments, new boundaries, and a level of accountability that didn't require any shouting to be real. I wasn't going to erase what had happened. I wasn't going to pretend that the situation would just fix itself if I ignored it. I was choosing to build something better for her, piece by piece, even if that process took much longer than a simple act of forgiveness usually does. The morning arrived quietly, with a pale gray light slipping through the blinds of my apartment. She woke up with a small, genuine smile on her face, looking surprised all over again by the comfort of the bed. I made her a bowl of oatmeal exactly the way she liked it, with way too much cinnamon on top. We sat at the small table and ate our breakfast without any rush. Later, when the calls from my parents started coming in again, I finally answered. The voices on the other end were much softer now. The initial anger had settled into something that looked a lot more like understanding. I spent more time listening than I did speaking. I said exactly what needed to be said, and I never once had to raise my voice. Weeks would pass before anything in our family started to resemble a normal routine again. Some of the bridges would eventually be repaired, while others would likely stay closed for a very long time. The consequences of that night arrived in quiet, subtle ways: changed routines, monitored finances, and the slow, agonizing work of rebuilding a shattered trust. There were no more champagne toasts, and no more countdowns, just the steady ticking of the clock and the hard knowledge that neglect doesn't simply vanish just because the calendar turns a page. On a clear, crisp afternoon not long after that, she sat by my living room window with a book resting in her lap, the winter sunlight warming her hands. She looked up at me and gave me a bright smile. "I really like it here," she said. "It feels very considerate." I let out a soft laugh. That was the entire goal, Grandma. She nodded, looking pleased with herself. "Then I think you're doing a very good job." That night, as I went around turning off the lights, I paused in the doorway of her room and looked back at her. She was already fast asleep, with the blankets tucked in just right. I whispered the words that had carried me through the hardest hours of that New Year's Eve, not as a warning to anyone, and not as a threat, but as a solemn promise I intended to keep for the rest of my life. She didn't sleep on the floor, and she never would again. If this story has stirred something deep inside of you, if it has reminded you of someone in your own life who deserves a chair by the fire and a warm bed of their own, I hope you will take a moment to think about them tonight. Perhaps you should reach out to them, or maybe just take the time to really listen. I would love to know what thoughts this story brought up for you today. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. We share stories like this every single day, stories about the hard choices we make, the quiet courage it takes to stand up for what is right, and the kind of love that actually shows up when it matters the most. If you don't want to miss our next story, please subscribe and stay with us on this journey. Let's keep walking this road together.